Scary telling.
I always knew that efficiency was the key to survival. Even before the bombs dropped, I was already planning ahead, thinking about what I would need to survive in a world that was quickly falling apart. I had always been a multitasker, juggling work and theft to make sure I had enough money to buy a shelter and stockpile supplies. I thought I had everything I needed to survive. But as the world around me crumbled into chaos, I realized that survival was about more than just being efficient. It was about more than just having enough food and water to last through the long, cold years. It was about human connection. In those early days, I was focused solely on survival. I had a routine that I stuck to religiously, spending every waking moment making sure that I had enough supplies to last me through the long, cold years. I would wake up early, check my stockpile, and then spend the rest of the day hunting for food and water. I was a machine, driven solely by my need to survive. But as the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years, I began to feel the weight of my isolation. I was alone in my shelter, with nothing but my supplies and my thoughts for company. I had always thought that I was self-sufficient, that I didn't need anyone else to survive. But as the loneliness set in, I realized how wrong I had been. I began to dream about human connection, about talking to someone else, sharing my thoughts and my fears. I tried to ignore these dreams, telling myself that they were a weakness, that they would distract me from my task. But the dreams persisted, and soon they became more vivid, more intense. One day, I heard a noise outside my shelter. It was a sound that I had never heard before, a sound that made my heart race. I grabbed my weapon and prepared to defend my supplies, but when I opened the door, I found a man lying on the ground, his leg badly injured. The man's name was Michael, and he begged for help, for shelter, for company. At first, I was wary. I couldn't afford to share my supplies, to risk my own survival for the sake of a stranger. But something in Michael's eyes made me pause. It was a look of desperation, of fear, of loneliness. It was a look that I knew all too well. I let Michael into my shelter, and we talked for hours. We shared our stories, our fears, our dreams. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of connection, of camaraderie. I realized that I had been wrong, that efficiency was not the only key to survival. Human connection was just as important, just as vital. As Michael drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder what the future would hold. I knew that sharing my supplies with him was a risk, that it could jeopardize my own survival. But I also knew that I needed him, that I needed his company, his conversation, his laughter. I had always been an efficient man, but now I realized that survival was about more than just efficiency. It was about the connections that we made, the relationships that we formed, the love that we shared. After Michael arrived, my daily routine changed. I had someone to talk to, someone to share my thoughts and fears with. We spent hours talking, playing games, and sharing stories. It was the first time in years that I had felt a sense of connection, of companionship. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, I began to feel a sense of unease. I had always been so focused on survival, on making sure that I had enough supplies to last through the long, cold years. But now that I had someone else to share my space with, I began to worry that our supplies would run out too quickly. I tried to push these thoughts aside, focusing instead on my tasks, on making sure that our shelter was secure, that our supplies were well stocked. But the thoughts persisted, nagging at the back of my mind. I knew that I couldn't afford to run out of supplies, that it would mean certain death for both of us. As the months turned into years, I began to feel a sense of routine setting in. Michael and I had fallen into a pattern, a routine that we followed every day. We would wake up early, check our supplies, and then spend the rest of the day doing tasks around the shelter. We had become like two cogs in a machine, working together to keep ourselves alive. But even as we worked together, I couldn't shake the feeling of loneliness that still lingered within me. I had thought that having Michael with me would alleviate my loneliness, but I realized that it was deeper than that. I longed for human connection, for touch, for intimacy. But in this new world, those things were scarce, almost non-existent. As the years went by, I became more and more desperate for human connection. I would dream about it at night, waking up to an empty bed, an empty shelter. It was a constant ache, a reminder of what I had lost. Despite this ache, I tried to focus on survival. I made sure that our shelter was secure, that our supplies were well stocked, that we had enough food and water to last through the long, cold years. But even as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of isolation, of loneliness, of despair. One day, as I was checking our supplies, I realized that we were running low on food. Panic set in as I realized that we might not have enough to last through the winter. I tried to keep my fear at bay, telling myself that I would find a way to get more food, that I would make sure that we both survived. But as the days passed, my fear turned into desperation. I knew that I needed to find more food, but I also knew that it would be risky to leave the safety of our shelter. I tried to ignore my hunger, focusing instead on my tasks, on making sure that our shelter was secure, that our supplies were well stocked. But even as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. I knew that I needed to find more food, to find a way to survive the long, cold winter. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, I realized that my survival was not just about efficiency. It was about the connections that I made, the relationships that I formed, the love that I shared. And I knew that if I was going to survive, I needed to find a way to reconcile these two things, efficiency and human connection. One day, as I was going through my usual routine, I heard a noise outside my shelter. At first, I thought it might be a stray animal or a group of raiders, so I grabbed my weapon and prepared for the worst. But as I opened the door, I found a man lying on the ground, badly injured. The man's name was Michael, and he begged for help, for shelter, for company. At first, I was hesitant to let him into my shelter. After all, I had spent years preparing for the apocalypse, and I couldn't afford to share my supplies with a stranger. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw desperation that I knew all too well. It was the same desperation that had driven me to stockpile supplies, to build a shelter, to focus solely on survival. I decided to take a chance on Michael, and I helped him into my shelter. As we talked, I realized that he was a good man, someone who had been caught up in the chaos of the apocalypse. He was just like me, someone who had been forced to adapt to survive. Over the next few days, Michael and I talked for hours. We shared stories, talked about our fears and our hopes. It was the first time in years that I had felt a sense of connection, of companionship. And as the days turned into weeks, I realized that I needed Michael just as much as he needed me. Despite this newfound companionship, there were still moments of tension between us. We both had our own ideas about how to survive, and sometimes those ideas clashed. But we worked through these moments, talking things out and finding compromises that worked for both of us. As the weeks turned into months, Michael and I settled into a routine. We would wake up early, check our supplies, and spend the rest of the day doing tasks around the shelter. It was a simple routine, but it gave us a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going. And as we worked, I began to realize how much I had missed human connection. It was a feeling that I had pushed aside for years, telling myself that I didn't need anyone else to survive. But now that I had Michael with me, I realized just how wrong I had been. With Michael by my side, I began to see the world in a new light. I no longer felt as though I was simply surviving. Instead, I felt as though I was living, experiencing the world in a way that I hadn't in years. I was still focused on efficiency, on making sure that we had enough supplies to last through the long, cold years. But now, I was also focused on human connection, on forming relationships and finding meaning in a world that had been shattered by disaster. As I watched Michael sleep that night, I realized that I had been given a second chance. I had been given a chance to form a connection, to experience the world in a new way. And I knew that I would do whatever it took to protect that connection, to make sure that we both survived the apocalypse together. As the years went by, Michael and I grew closer. We had formed a strong bond, and I knew that I could count on him to help me survive. But even as our friendship deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling that our supplies were running low. We had been so focused on survival, on making sure that we had enough food and water to last through the long, cold years, that we hadn't thought about what would happen if our supplies ran out. I tried not to worry, telling myself that I would find a way to get more food, that I would make sure that we both survived. But as the days passed, my fear turned into desperation. I knew that I needed to find more food, to find a way to survive the long, cold winter. One day, as Michael was sleeping, I looked at our dwindling supplies and realized that I had to make a difficult decision. I knew that I couldn't let both of us starve, that I had to do whatever it took to ensure our survival. With a heavy heart, I prepared my saw. I knew what I had to do, but it didn't make it any easier. I approached Michael, who was sleeping soundly, and I lifted the saw. He woke up just as I was about to strike, and he looked at me with fear in his eyes. I knew that what I was doing was wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. Hunger was in need too, and I was an efficient man. As I lowered the saw onto Michael's leg, he screamed and begged for mercy. But I didn't listen. I couldn't afford to let us both starve. When it was over, I felt sick. I couldn't believe what I had done. I had hurt my friend, someone who had been with me through thick and thin. But even as I felt the weight of my guilt, I knew that I had made the right decision. Survival was about more than just human connection. It was about efficiency, about doing whatever it took to ensure that you lived to see another day. As I watched Michael limp around the shelter, I couldn't help but feel a sense of regret. I had hurt someone that I cared about, someone who had become like family to me. But even as I felt this regret, I knew that I had to keep going. I couldn't afford to let my emotions cloud my judgment. I had to keep moving forward, to keep doing what was necessary to ensure that we both survived. Over the next few weeks, Michael and I talked less and less. The atmosphere in the shelter had changed, becoming tense and uncomfortable. We both knew what I had done, and we both knew that it had changed things between us. Despite this tension, we still worked together, doing what we could to survive. But it was different now, colder and more distant. We both knew that something had been lost, something that we could never get back. As the years went by, I realized that what I had done to Michael had cost me more than just his leg. It had cost me my sense of humanity, my sense of compassion. I had become so focused on survival, on efficiency, that I had lost sight of what was truly important: human connection, love, and compassion. And as I watched Michael limp around our shelter, I knew that I had to find a way to reconcile these two things. I had to find a way to balance efficiency with human connection, to ensure that I was not just surviving, but truly living. As the years went by, Michael and I settled into a new routine. We still worked together, but there was a distance between us that had never been there before. I knew that what I had done to him had changed things between us, and I didn't know how to fix it. But even as we worked in silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had lost something important. I had become so focused on survival, on efficiency, that I had lost sight of what was truly important: human connection, love, and compassion. One day, as I was going through our supplies, I found a letter that Michael had written. In it, he talked about his life before the apocalypse, about his family and his friends. He talked about the love that he had felt for those people and the pain that he felt when he lost them. Reading Michael's words, I realized that I had been so focused on survival that I had forgotten about love and compassion. I had forgotten about the connections that make life worth living, about the relationships that bring us joy and comfort. I knew that I had to make things right with Michael. I had to find a way to reconcile efficiency with compassion to ensure that we both survived while still valuing the connections that we had formed. So, I approached Michael and I apologized for what I had done. I told him that I had been wrong, that I had lost sight of what was truly important in life. I told him that I wanted to make things right, that I wanted to find a way to balance efficiency with compassion. To my surprise, Michael forgave me. He understood that survival was important, but he also knew that human connection was equally important. Together, we worked to find a balance between efficiency and compassion to ensure that we both survived while still valuing our relationship. Over the next few years, Michael and I worked together in a new way. We still focused on survival, on efficiency, but we also focused on the connections that we had formed. We talked more, shared our feelings and fears, and found ways to support each other through the long, cold years. And as we worked together, I began to see the world in a new way. I realized that survival was not just about efficiency, but also about compassion and human connection. I realized that I had been given a second chance, a chance to form a connection, to experience the world in a new way. As I watched Michael limp around the shelter, I knew that what we had was worth fighting for. Our connection, our relationship, was what made life worth living. And I was willing to do whatever it took to protect that connection, to ensure that we both survived the apocalypse together, while valuing the human connections that we had formed.